Hello and welcome to Into the Woods with Holly Worton. This podcast has evolved over the 5+ years since it first launched. From now on, I'm going to be talking about deepening your connection with yourself, taking inspired action, and really trusting yourself and your intuition. And also mindset, of course, but mindset of all kinds, not just business mindset. I think. Things are changing for me, as you may have noticed if you've been following me online or listening to this podcast, so anything goes here. I hope you stay along for the ride. Thank you so much for joining us today, and now let's get into this week's episode. Hello and welcome to the Into the Woods podcast, episode 291. I just had to redo this intro because I started out saying, welcome to the Business Mindset podcast. However, we're clearly not there anymore. So welcome to the Into the Woods podcast, 291. We're almost at 300 episodes. I cannot believe this podcast has come so far and gone through so many changes in the last 5.5 years. But we can talk about that later. This is your host, Holly Worton, and I'm back with another solo episode. Today, I'm going to talk about vulnerability. Now, this is something that I've talked about before on the podcast. We've got episode 161 with Allison Bird, which was a great episode. And she was talking about how vulnerability can kill your cash flow, basically how not to use vulnerability in business. Before that, we had episode 114 with Worton, how to be vulnerable and tell your story without shame. That was a great episode because she was talking about something from her past that was a bit tricky, that could bring on some judgment perhaps from people, and how rather than ignoring that part of her past, she decided to just put it out there, front and center, talking about it, not being ashamed of it. That was a great episode. Way before that, episode 20, we talked with Celestine Chua, who is a very, very, very successful blogger. And we did an episode called How to Build a Successful Business Around Your Blog. And in it, we talked about vulnerability and how she believes that her willingness to open up and be vulnerable on her blog, even back in the early days, was what helped her achieve success with her business, which she built around her blog. So this podcast has touched upon vulnerability before, and something that's kind of been going on in my mind because I think I'm feeling very vulnerable with my tree book, which will be coming out in April. I've got a hard deadline that I've given myself on that now. So it's not December, not January, it's April, and it's happening in April. But as I've touched on before, I'm feeling really vulnerable about this because it's a topic that, while I'm okay talking to you about it and talking to most of my friends about it, it's not something that I feel comfortable talking about with everyone. And I've done a ton of mindset work on that, but I know I've still got a ways to go. And I think part of it's just going to be getting the book out there, sharing it with the world, and seeing people's reactions to it. So, vulnerability is a hot topic for me right now. And I wanted to kind of share that with you and discuss that with you. Now, this is my first episode that I'm recording since I've come back from my holiday or semi-holiday in the States. I was gone for 3 weeks during the month of January, and I was so super organized in getting all of my podcast episodes recorded before I left. Not just all the episodes that came out while I was gone, but for the next 2 weeks after, because I knew I'd be having jet lag and it would take a while for me to get back into the swing of things. And I'm actually really grateful to myself for having done that because it's really nice to kind of finally be back, be settled in, and kind of have my brain back in gear fully to do an actual episode. So I've been feeling a bit disconnected from the podcast because I keep seeing these episodes going live and kind of sharing them in the Patreon and online, and it feels like it's been so long ago I did the topics. And so I'm really happy to be kind of back on track doing the episodes shortly before they come out. Now, there was a time on this podcast when I like to have a 6 to 8 week kind of advance in my getting the interviews done, in my production. That's the word. I have a word. So in my production of the podcast, I would usually be 6 to 8 weeks in advance. And I really liked that. And that was really important because I had a lot of guests on the podcast. And so it was important to get things lined up. But I'm really, really enjoying doing these episodes not long before they come out because I feel like they're really kind of timely for me. And it's easier for me to have these conversations and put them out there and then kind of respond to the feedback that I get. So where did this topic come from? So I have this note in my Evernote file that's on podcast topics. So anytime someone writes in, whether it's a friend, a listener, and says, hey, I have an idea for your podcast, I just copy and paste it in there. And whenever it feels timely to do, I just do that episode. So for ages now, I've had this topic, kind of this bullet point on my list that says, the power of vulnerability and not always having to be the strong person. I've been reading Brené Brown. Brené Brown is someone who, if you haven't heard of her, talks about and writes a lot about vulnerability. I think she's actually done a TED video talk on that. And I'm actually going to look that up now, and so I can share the link for you in the show notes. Yes, it's a TED Talk called Power of Vulnerability, and she's also written a lot of books that touch on this topic as well. And I actually started to read one a few years ago, and I couldn't get into it, and I kind of shelved it, and it's kind of there in the background. I know I'll get back to it at some point, but for some reason it couldn't get into it. But a lot of people I know are huge fans of Brené Brown and how she talks about vulnerability. So if you feel drawn to that, check out the show notes. I've got the link in there, and you can look her up on Amazon and find one of her books. So I've had this topic in there, and because I never got into her books, I think it was kind of a topic that I thought, I touched on for a while, and I don't know, do I need to talk about this again? And then all of a sudden, it kind of felt like the right time. So let's talk vulnerability. First of all, what is it? According to an internet dictionary, it is the quality or state of being exposed to the possibility of being attacked or harmed, either physically or emotionally. So I think in this online world that we're all a part of, I think a lot of us think of vulnerability in terms of opening up and really sharing personal stuff, whether it's online, on a podcast, on a blog, on our websites, in a book if you're a writer, in music, if you're a writer, in a YouTube video, in any of our online or offline content. And it's a quality that I've been aware of for many years now in terms of it being an important part of content. And it's something that I always felt like I wished that I were good at. And I think it's something that I've developed little by little over time without really realizing it, without really being conscious of the fact that I was doing it. It's kind of like on some level I set the intention that I wanted to open up and share more of myself and be more vulnerable online and in my content. And I was afraid of it, and I know I've done mindset work on it over the years. And at some point it just kind of happened. I think because the intention was there and it was something that I knew I wanted to do. The question is, if we're looking at opening ourselves up to the possibility of being attacked or harmed or criticized, why would we do that? So if you go on Google and do a search as to why vulnerability is important, if you watch Brené Brown's TED Talk, I'm sure you'll come up with a lot of different responses. But I think, in my opinion and from my perspective, they all boil down to one thing, and that is connection. Because vulnerability helps us connect to other people, whether we're being vulnerable in an offline relationship with friends or family. It helps us form deeper connections with those people. And if we're creating content and sharing it online, whether it's in a video, a blog post, a book, by opening ourselves up and being vulnerable, it's helping us build connections with our reader, with our followers, with our watchers. So to me, vulnerability is important because it's all about creating connections with people, deepening connections with people. When we open up and we share personal stories, it makes it easier for people to connect with us. I've gotten some really lovely emails lately from people and Facebook messages from people who listen to the podcast, and I love hearing from listeners. So if you've ever felt like writing to me, please do, because I love getting your feedback. Even if you don't have an idea for a podcast topic, you just want to say, hey, I liked this episode. That's really useful to me. Like, I love hearing it because it makes me feel good, but it's also really useful because I know the stuff that people like. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of download numbers in my Libsyn account. I like to hear from listeners. So someone sent me an email a couple weeks, well, it's probably last month, I think, and said, and this is kind of an abbreviated version of the email. I just wanted to send my appreciation. I've been following your podcast for a while, and I really love the new direction that you're taking. I really resonate with your stories and podcast topics. Of all my podcasts, yours is the only one that I'm always up to date on and anxiously awaiting the next release. So I wrote back to this person and thanked her for sending in the email, and it's been on my mind ever since because, first of all, I love hearing that someone's anxiously awaiting the next release of my podcast episodes because it makes me realize that the work that I'm doing is valuable and people like it and they look forward to hearing it. Now, I know that because I do hear from people, but I like continuing to hear from people because it just reminds me that the work that I'm doing is important and that it's serving a purpose of helping people. But why does this person really resonate with my stories and podcast topics? I personally think it's because I'm opening myself up more and more, and I'm being more and more vulnerable on this podcast, in my books. And that's what connects with people. That's what helps people get to know me and like me, I guess, if you're still listening to this podcast. If you didn't like me, you probably wouldn't be listening to it. And, trust my advice and my opinions and my perspective. And no matter what it is that you do, whether or not you're a business owner, whether you're a content creator, if you're doing stuff online or doing stuff offline, it's this willingness to open up and share and be vulnerable that helps create the connections with people that you're going to need if you want people to buy your products or services, read more of your books, watch more of your videos, read more of your blog posts, like whatever it is that you do. And even if you don't do any of those things, like you probably have a job or you do something in the world where other human beings are involved. And when you open up and share, it helps create stronger connections. The question that always comes up when we talk about vulnerability is, when is it appropriate to share and open up and be vulnerable? How do I do it? Where do I do it? How do I know how much is too much? And these are all super valid questions. And if you haven't listened to episode 161 with Allison Bird, where she talked about how vulnerability can kill your cash flow, do listen to it. I think that's a really good one where she shares kind of some do's and don'ts and when it's okay to share what. And to distill that down into kind of a simple concept, one of the things that she was saying is, if you're going through something big and emotional, don't share about it when you're in the middle of it. Like when the crap is happening and you feel like shit and you don't know what to do about it and you're feeling lost and confused and that's not necessarily the time to share about it. The time that's useful to share about it is when you've come out the other side and you've got the learnings from that experience. So you know what you've learned from it and you know what it's given you, you know how it's changed your life, and you can share that with other people in the sense of not just I've been through this crap, but the sense of I've been through this crap, here's what I've learned from it, here's what you can learn from it so that you can hopefully avoid a similar situation in your life. Or here's what you can learn from it if you're currently going through a similar situation in your life. So when you've gone through the crap and you're out on the other side, that seems to be a much more appropriate place to open up and share. Unless your thing is all about kind of being in the moment. I, some time ago, interviewed Shelby Forsythia, who has a podcast about grief. And we talked about grief, and She was absolutely wonderful on the show. I'll link to that in the show notes as well. I was a guest on her podcast. I listen to her podcast from time to time. And I remember at one point, and I'll look for this episode and share it with you, I think she did an episode called This Is What Grief Looks Like. And her thing is grief. So it made sense for her to share a very teary episode where she was in the middle of it. So if something like grief or intense emotion is your business thing or your blog thing or your content thing or whatever, then it makes sense for you to share when you're a blubbering mess in the middle of your grief or whatever emotion it is that is your thing. So that was a really short episode, if I remember correctly. And I'll look for that, share it in the show notes, listen to it, because that kind of thing is super appropriate for her. Yes, she could also kind of come out from the other side and do an episode on it, and that would also be appropriate. But because grief is her thing, it's appropriate for her to share when she's in the middle of the grief. Even if it's not pretty, even if there are no learnings from it in the moment, it's useful for her and for her audience to have her do an episode like that is so emotionally charged. So how to do it? For me, opening up more and being more vulnerable has come in the form of telling stories. I think I've told a lot of stories here that have been really personal and things that I haven't always felt comfortable sharing in other places. So my advice would be to start with baby steps. Start with where it feels safe. So maybe make a list of where it feels safe to share. So for me, my podcast is safe. My Facebook group, when I had it, was safe. My Patreon is safe for different reasons. So my Facebook group, or my ex-Facebook group, and my Patreon are closed communities. So people choose to be in there. On Patreon, you pay to be there. These are people who know me and I know who they are. And so it's kind of a closed community that felt really safe. The podcast is not a closed community. I mean, anyone could subscribe to this podcast. Anyone could listen to it. But it's kind of a big investment of time to listen to podcast. Each episode is at least a half an hour long, and the fact that people are subscribed and listening to it means that they want to be here. You wouldn't listen to this if you didn't want to be here, if you didn't want to listen to it, if you didn't want to hear what I have to say. So the podcast is not a closed community, but it feels like a safe community because it's like people have already opted out for the most part if they know that my thing is not for them. To me, my blog would be more open. Again, you wouldn't be reading my blog if you didn't like me. Of course, you could arrive there through a Google search that triggered some keywords that were on my blog, but it's still kind of, you're probably going to be there if you know me. What feels less safe for me in terms of places to open up and be vulnerable? YouTube, for sure, because I feel like that can be a very toxic audience sometimes. And my books, because those are much wider audiences. My books go on Amazon and other online retailers, and any old person can buy them. Especially my ebooks are very reasonably priced on purpose, and that means that I'm open up to people who are willing to just take a risk on a book, and, even if they don't know me. So those areas feel less safe, and I think I've been kind of less open and vulnerable on YouTube for that reason. I have tried to be more open and vulnerable in my books to the point where it really kind of scares the crap out of me sometimes. I still get very uncomfortable about all of my walking books, especially the first one. And the first one, interestingly, is the biggest seller because it's the most well-known trail, which is the one about the South Downs Way. So in those walking books, I share the reality of what it's like for me to walk a trail. And especially in the beginning, it was really hard for me. And I kind of cringe a little bit when I think about people that don't know me reading those books. And while I've received really good feedback from people I don't know who have read those books and have emailed me to let me know what they think, or to thank me for sharing my experience, it still feels really uncomfortable for me to put that out there because I was really open and unfiltered and vulnerable in those books. And I'm aware that, most people that write books about walking long trails probably much more physically fit than I am, or, have had less of a rough experience or have chosen not to share those details in their books. Because I read a lot of walking books and I see that there's not as much kind of blood and tears as there were in especially my first book. So that's kind of my scope of what feels safe and what feels less safe. However, I've chosen to open up on certain forums that feel less safe, such as my books, because it's important for me to connect with my readers, and I want my readers to connect with me, and I want them to know my truth of my experiences. I perhaps haven't opened up as much as I would have liked to in my business mindset books, but there were some personal business stories in there. And this upcoming tree book is a book that feels really, really vulnerable to me because that's where I'm talking about channeling trees, talking to trees, doing something that I know I'm not the only person in the world that talks to trees and hears them talk back. Lots of people do. I know people that do, but it's not a mainstream thing. And I know this is not going to be a mainstream book, but my intention is to get it out there to a much wider audience. So again, going back to my original question, how to do it, where to do it. Start with baby steps. Figure out what feels safe to you and just do a little bit of it. Share some stories. If you're a blogger, share some more kind of personal stories on your blog that are related to the topic of your blog. Try it on YouTube if you want to. Don't do it there if it's too scary for you. Do it in your books. Pick a content type and a location and start small. Start with baby steps and do it because it's like a muscle. It grows with practice and it gets easier with practice. I don't think twice before telling very personal stories and stuff that's very uncomfortable for me here on the podcast because I now feel safe here and I feel safe telling stories there. And even though I get uncomfortable thinking about some of the stuff that I've shared in my books, I'm going to keep sharing personal stuff in my books because that's kind of the point for me of writing these books, is helping to connect with my readers through these personal stories. So start small, start where it feels safe, and then practice and grow from there, because I feel like opening up in this way is like a muscle. It grows with practice, it gets easier, and the more you do it, the more connections you will make with people. Again, no matter what it is that you do, whether you're a blogger, whether you're a YouTuber, whether you have a business that uses these channels to, create content, or whether you're a person with a job and you want to connect with people more at work. Now, that's really tricky. You probably don't want to get too personal at work because there's kind of a professional boundary there that's really important to keep. But you could share examples of where you've tried stuff and it didn't work at a previous job or at a previous business, and use that as an example of why you think things need to be done in a certain way. You might not necessarily want to share a very personal story about your home or family life, but sharing professional stories can help you to create connections with people. So play around with it. Again, start small, see what works for you, and grow that vulnerability muscle. And please feel free to let me know how it goes for you. And if you have any questions about, would a specific story be useful to share, or is it appropriate or inappropriate, feel free to drop me an email. Let me know what you're thinking about sharing. I'm happy to read through it, assuming it's not too long, and give you some feedback, because I think twice before sharing stuff. I always map out these podcast episodes before I record them. And I think about certain stories, things that have been going on in my life that are relevant to the episode, and I kind of include them in bullet points. And I think about what to include before I do this. So it's not like I'm just, pop on here and spontaneously just blab my personal life and business life and professional life to you. I think about what I'm doing before I do it. I make a conscious decision what stories I'm going to share and what stories I'm not going to share. And there you go. It's absolutely something that you can add to your business, add to your content, add to your creativity. by planning in advance and thinking about what you're willing and what you're not willing to share, and then kind of stepping out of your comfort zone little by little and building that vulnerability muscle. So again, drop me a line. Let me know what you thought of this episode. I would love to hear from you. I love your feedback. My email is holly@hollyworton.com, or you can find me online and get in touch there. Finally, as always, I would love for you to join me on Patreon. If you head to patreon.com/Holly Worton, you can join me there. Membership starts at just $1 a month, and you will get exclusive access to content I don't share anywhere else, including a monthly Q&A. As always, I would like to welcome new members, Mary Madsen Heskin, who actually joined last month, but I had already done all of the podcast episodes, so I couldn't welcome her in that episode. So, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. And remember to visit hollyworton.com/291 for the show notes on this episode. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening to Into the Woods with Holly Worton. You can find more information about today's episode, including links for topics that were discussed, at hollyworton.com. That's HOLLYWORTON.com. If you'd like to connect with other listeners and get support on your journey, I would love for you to join my private community on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Holly Worton. That's patreon.com/Holly Worton. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next week.